Police handcuff an innocent black man, then turn pale when they discover he's a prominent lawyer. Marcus Williams had always prided himself on his calm demeanor and his ability to navigate the world with grace. It wasn't always easy, being a black man in a city where opportunities weren't always handed out equally. But Marcus had defied the odds. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, yet he had become one of the most successful lawyers in the city. His reputation for standing up for justice, for fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, had made him a respected figure in the legal community. On this particular afternoon, Marcus was walking down a street he knew well. It wasn't far from his office, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. He had just wrapped up a case and was heading home, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. His thoughts were preoccupied with the events of the day, the arguments in court, the clients he had helped, and the cases that still weighed on his mind. But as often happens in the hustle of city life, Marcus found himself lost in thought as he walked, unaware of the subtle changes happening around him. Up ahead, two police officers were standing by a street corner. Their eyes were scanning the crowd, watching the passing pedestrians with an air of suspicion. To anyone else, they might have just seemed like ordinary officers doing their job. But Marcus, with his experience in the legal world, could immediately tell that there was something off about the way they were observing the crowd. He slowed his pace, thinking about the cases he had worked on, the countless times he had seen racial profiling in action. He had seen it too many times to be unaware of it now. The officers, meanwhile, were focused on Marcus. One of them, Officer Harris, nudged his partner, Officer Green. "That's him," Harris muttered under his breath. "The suspect we're looking for, same build, same height." Officer Green nodded, his eyes narrowing. They had received a vague description from an anonymous caller, someone who claimed to have seen a man acting suspiciously in the area. The description was vague, about 6 feet tall, wearing a black suit and moving quickly. It was the kind of description that could apply to nearly anyone, but the officers had already made up their minds. They had been trained to act quickly in situations like this, not to question every small detail. They moved in. Marcus didn't notice them approach until one of the officers stepped directly into his path, blocking his way. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Green said, his voice firm. "We need to speak with you for a moment." Marcus looked up, surprised, but he didn't panic. He had dealt with police officers before, both as a lawyer and as a citizen. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but calm. "We're just asking a few questions," Officer Harris replied, his hand already resting near his belt, ready to make a move if necessary. His eyes were scanning Marcus up and down, already sizing him up. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He had already suspected that something was off, but he wasn't about to make assumptions. "What's this about?" he asked again, his posture remaining relaxed. "Just step over here for a moment," Officer Green said, motioning toward the side of the street. The officers had already made up their minds. They were going to question him, no matter what. "Look, I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice firm now as he stood his ground. He wasn't about to let them intimidate him. He knew his rights, and he wasn't going to let them treat him as though he was guilty of something without cause. "If you think I've done something, I'm happy to talk to you, but I'd appreciate it if you'd tell me why I'm being stopped." The officers exchanged a glance. They hadn't expected him to stand up to them like this. Most people, when approached by the police, would just comply, not wanting to make things more difficult. But Marcus wasn't most people. He was a lawyer, a man who understood how easily the law could be bent and twisted when people weren't paying attention. And he wasn't about to let that happen to him. Officer Harris stepped closer, his hand still hovering near his belt. "We're just trying to do our job, sir. Please, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus could feel his pulse quicken slightly. He knew that tone of voice. He had heard it before in courtrooms, in police reports, in the stories of his clients. It was the tone of someone who was about to escalate a situation unnecessarily. He wasn't going to let that happen. He kept his voice calm but firm. "I'm not trying to make anything hard, but I need to know what's going on." "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Officer Green said, his voice getting sharper now. "We just need to make sure you're not the person we're looking for." Marcus' mind began to race, but he kept his face composed. He had heard of incidents like this before, police officers stopping someone based on a vague description, sometimes leading to nothing but frustration and embarrassment for the person being stopped. But Marcus knew that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how often it happened to black men like him, how often it turned into something far worse than a simple misunderstanding. He had witnessed it countless times with his clients, but this time, it was happening to him. "Look, I'm not going anywhere with you unless you tell me what this is about," Marcus said, his voice getting firmer. The officers didn't listen. Instead, they moved in quickly, each officer grabbing one of his arms and pulling them behind his back. Marcus tried to stay calm, but the rush of adrenaline made his hands tighten into fists. "Hey, what are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm a lawyer, you can't just—" Before he could finish his sentence, the officers had him in handcuffs. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't happening. Not to him, not to someone who had spent his life working for justice, who had helped so many people avoid the very situations he now found himself in. As they led him to the police car, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. His mind raced with thoughts of how this was going to play out. Would they take him to the station? Would he be forced to sit there, humiliated, while they tried to figure out who he was? He knew the system, and he knew how easily a simple mistake could turn into something much worse. The officers didn't say much as they put him in the back of the car, but Marcus could feel their unease. They weren't sure what to make of him. He was calm, too calm, considering the situation. They had expected him to be scared, to plead for release. But he wasn't scared. He wasn't going to beg for his freedom. He had fought for people like him his entire career, and now it was his turn to fight for himself. As the car pulled away, Marcus took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Marcus sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, his hands still cuffed, but this time he was sitting on the hard bench, trying to gather his thoughts. His mind was racing, but his body remained calm, controlled. He wasn't about to let fear or frustration take over. He had been in tough situations before, discussions in courtrooms where the odds seemed stacked against him, defending clients who had been wronged by the system. But this felt different. It wasn't just another case. It was his own life, his own freedom on the line. He glanced around the small, bare room. The harsh fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a sterile glow on the chipped walls. Outside, through the bars of the cell, he could hear the distant sounds of police officers moving about, the occasional murmur of voices, the tapping of shoes on the tile floor. The building felt cold, as though it was designed to make anyone inside feel small and insignificant. But Marcus wasn't going to let it break him. He wasn't just a man trapped in a holding cell. He was Marcus Williams, a lawyer who had spent his life helping others navigate the injustices of the world. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Marcus started to think about how this all began. It had started out as a normal day, or so he thought. A busy day at the office, filled with meetings, paperwork, and the usual grind of legal work. He had just wrapped up a particularly intense case that had taken up much of his attention over the past few weeks. It was one of those cases where every decision, every argument had to be carefully thought out. The stakes had been high, and the tension had been palpable. But now here he was, locked up in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. His mind drifted to his family. His wife, Janet, and their 2 children, Sophie and Liam. They were probably sitting at home, waiting for him to walk through the door just like any other evening. He could imagine Janet's voice, asking how his day had gone, and the kids' excitement when he came home to play with them. Marcus had always prided himself on being there for his family, no matter how busy his career got. And now, he wasn't sure when he would be able to see them again. He had no idea how long this situation would last. But even more than his family, Marcus thought about the bigger picture. He thought about the countless people he had helped over the years, clients who had faced the same challenges, the same injustices, but on a much larger scale. People who had been targeted by the system, who had been made to feel small and insignificant, just like he was feeling now. It was one of the reasons he had become a lawyer in the first place, to fight for those who didn't have the power or resources to fight for themselves. But right now, it felt like the system was turning against him. He could feel his anger bubbling up, but he kept it in check. Anger wasn't going to help him now. He needed to stay calm, to think clearly. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was personal. This wasn't just about representing someone in court. This was about his own dignity, his own rights being violated. Marcus had worked his entire career to navigate the fine line between law and justice, to understand the nuances of both. And now, for the first time, he was on the other side of that line, facing the very system he had spent his life working within. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to the holding area opened, and a police officer stepped inside. He was tall, wearing a dark blue uniform, his expression unreadable. Marcus stood up, his hands still restrained by the cuffs, and met the officer's gaze. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he wasn't about to let the officer intimidate him. "Mr. Williams," the officer said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of something else in it, perhaps nervousness. "We've been trying to sort this out. It seems there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Marcus didn't say anything at first. He was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of it all. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice flat. "That's what this is," the officer nodded. "Yes, we received a call about a suspect in the area and you fit the description. But it turns out, well, we've made an error. We're working on getting you released." Marcus' mind was racing again, but he kept his face neutral. "I see. So you arrested me based on a vague description, and now you're realizing I'm not the person you thought I was." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We understand this is frustrating, but we're doing everything we can to clear this up." Frustrating? Marcus felt more than frustration. He felt a deep sense of disbelief. How could this have happened? How could a mistake this big have been made? He knew that these kinds of things happened all the time, especially to people of color, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. He had worked his whole life to get to where he was, to prove that he deserved the same respect and opportunities as anyone else. And yet here he was, sitting in a holding cell, just another black man caught up in a system that had a history of treating people like him with suspicion and disdain. "I just want to go home," Marcus said, finally letting his frustration show. His voice was calm, but the anger underneath was clear. He didn't want to be here anymore, didn't want to waste another second of his life on this mistake. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was the one paying the price. "We're working on it," the officer repeated, his voice more apologetic now. "You'll be out of here soon, just bear with us a little longer." Marcus nodded, but he wasn't convinced. It wasn't the officer's fault, not entirely, but that didn't matter to him right now. All he could think about was how easily this situation could have spiraled out of control. He had seen it happen too many times to count. People like him, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, paying the price for someone else's mistakes. As the officer left, closing the door behind him, Marcus sat back down on the bench. His mind was still racing, but he tried to push aside the panic that threatened to rise within him. He had been in control of his life for so long, and now he was being forced to wait, to be at the mercy of a system that had already failed him once. But Marcus wasn't going to let it break him. He knew his worth. He knew what he had accomplished in his life. And no matter how this turned out, no matter how long he had to wait, he wasn't going to let this experience define him. He thought about what he would do once he was free, how he would make sure this kind of thing never happened again, not to him and not to anyone else. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing up for what was right, about making sure that those in power were held accountable for their actions. And as he sat there in the holding cell, waiting for someone to fix the mistake that had been made, Marcus knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching out endlessly for Marcus as he sat in the small holding cell. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He was anxious, of course, but more than that, he was angry. Not at the officers who had detained him, although he didn't trust them, but at the entire situation. How could something like this happen? In a world where he had built a career, a reputation, and a family, this felt like an unfair twist of fate. It was a reminder that no matter how successful he became, no matter how much he fought for justice in the courtroom, there would always be forces beyond his control. Forces that had the power to define his life without reason. Marcus leaned back against the cold metal wall of the cell, his arms crossed. He was trying to stay calm, trying not to let the weight of the situation crush him. He had worked with clients who had faced injustices far greater than his own, clients who had been wrongfully accused of crimes, just as he had been today. He knew how important it was to remain calm, to think strategically, and to never let emotions cloud his judgment. But this felt different. This wasn't just another case. This was about his own freedom. Despite everything, Marcus knew he couldn't afford to let panic take over. He had been through enough battles in his career to understand that there was always a way out, always a way to make things right, if you knew how to fight. And fight he would. He had no intention of letting this go. He was going to clear his name, and if necessary, he would fight for change in the system that had failed him so easily. Just as he was starting to lose himself in these thoughts, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching once again. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the footsteps of a guard or a random officer. It was the familiar sound of someone who had come to speak to him. Marcus stood up quickly, his heart racing. He had been hoping for this moment. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The door to the holding cell swung open, and standing there was Officer Green, the same officer who had been part of his initial detention. Green was holding a folder in his hands, and his face looked different than before. Gone was the cool, professional demeanor that had marked their earlier encounter. Now there was an air of discomfort, of uncertainty. The officer stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. He looked at Marcus, his gaze softening. "Mr. Williams," Officer Green began, his voice hesitant. "I owe you an apology. This has been a mistake, and I can't tell you how sorry I am for what happened." Marcus didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure what to say. He had spent hours stewing in frustration, but now he had to stay composed. The apology was unexpected, but it didn't change the fact that he had been wronged. He was still sitting in a holding cell, and the system that was supposed to protect him had failed. "I'm listening," Marcus said finally, his voice low but calm. Officer Green hesitated before continuing. "We've double-checked the information. We received a tip about a suspect in the area, someone who fit your description. We acted on that information without fully verifying it. We were wrong, Mr. Williams. I'm sorry we put you through this." Marcus absorbed the words, but they did little to ease his anger. The apology felt half-hearted, like it was being offered because it was expected. "So you arrested me based on a vague description and didn't think to verify any of the facts before acting?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Green lowered his eyes, ashamed. "I know it's not an excuse, but we acted on what we thought was a lead. We didn't know who you were, but now, after checking everything, we know you're not involved in any crime. This was a misunderstanding, and we're doing everything we can to release you." Marcus couldn't help but feel frustrated at the officer's words. The whole situation seemed so simple now. If they had just taken the time to properly investigate the tip before making an arrest, this would never have happened. But that was the problem, wasn't it? People like Marcus, black men, were often subjected to suspicion and mistrust based on nothing but their appearance. The system was quick to label, quick to arrest, and slow to correct its mistakes. "I appreciate the apology," Marcus said, though it was clear he wasn't fully convinced. "But I'm still sitting here waiting for you to fix the mistake you made. How much longer do I have to wait?" Officer Green seemed to sense Marcus' growing impatience. "We're pushing for your release now. The paperwork is being processed, but I need to tell you something else." His eyes flicked to the folder in his hand. "We looked into your background, we discovered who you are, what you do for a living, and we realized we made a huge error." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. His first instinct was to be cautious. "What do you mean?" Green hesitated again before speaking, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "You're a lawyer, a well-known lawyer. You've worked on high-profile cases. And honestly, we should have recognized that sooner. I'm not making excuses for what happened, but your name, your reputation, it should have triggered something in our heads when we stopped you. We didn't do our due diligence, and now we've put you in this position." The officer's words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had worked his entire career to build a reputation, to stand out in the legal world for his work and his passion for justice. And now his reputation, something he had earned through years of hard work, had played a role in his own humiliation. It was surreal, but Marcus couldn't deny the truth in Green's words. He was a prominent lawyer, and still, the officers hadn't hesitated to arrest him. "I'm not sure what you expect me to say," Marcus said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of bitterness now. "You've made a mistake. I'm not the person you thought I was, but you still treated me like I was guilty of something, and I'm supposed to just accept that." Officer Green nodded, understanding the depth of Marcus' frustration. "I understand. I'm not asking you to accept it, Mr. Williams. All I can do is assure you that we're working to fix this as quickly as possible, and I want to make sure this never happens again." Marcus leaned against the wall again, his mind racing. This was far from over. The mistake had been made, but that didn't mean he was going to walk away quietly. This wasn't just about his own experience. It was about the countless other people who had been wrongfully arrested and treated like criminals based on nothing more than their appearance. "I'm going to make sure this gets taken care of," Marcus said, his voice firm. "And I'm not going to let it slide. You can't just arrest people without consequences, not when lives are at stake." Green looked at him, the weight of the situation settling over them both. "I understand, Mr. Williams. We're working on it. I'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." With that, the officer turned and walked out of the cell, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He still felt a deep sense of injustice, but he wasn't going to let it define him. He had been wronged, but he wasn't about to let it be the end of his story. He had a responsibility to fight back, to ensure that what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. As he waited for his release, Marcus couldn't help but think about the fight ahead. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making sure the system was held accountable for its mistakes. And as the door to the holding cell clicked open, Marcus stood up, ready to face whatever came next. The door to Marcus' holding cell swung open again, but this time it wasn't Officer Green stepping inside. Instead, it was a team of officers, including a woman who appeared to be in charge. She walked with purpose, her steps echoing in the silence of the room. The weight of what had happened in the last few hours was still heavy on Marcus' shoulders, but now there was something different in the air. He could feel it. They were finally going to make things right. At least that was the hope. "Mr. Williams," the officer in charge said, her voice calm and measured. "I'm Officer Thompson, and I'm here to make sure this situation is resolved. I know this has been a frustrating experience for you, and I want to personally apologize for what happened." Marcus stood up slowly, his posture tense. He had been through so much already, and though he appreciated her words, he knew actions spoke louder than apologies. "I appreciate the apology, but I'm still not sure how this happened. How could the system fail so completely? I know mistakes happen, but how was this allowed to go so far?" Officer Thompson sighed, looking at him with an understanding gaze. "That's a fair question, and one that we need to address. We're looking into how the initial decision was made and what went wrong. This isn't just about your case anymore. It's about the bigger issue of how we treat people, how we assess situations based on limited information." Marcus could feel his frustration start to rise again. He had been through enough delays, enough uncertainty, and he was growing tired of waiting for explanations. Still, he kept his tone calm. "I understand that mistakes happen, but this was more than just a mistake. I was treated as a criminal without cause. What happens next? How do you ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" The officer seemed to consider his words for a moment before responding. "We're implementing new protocols for how we handle situations like yours. We'll be looking at the training procedures, the way we evaluate tips, and the overall treatment of individuals during stops. There's no excuse for this, Mr. Williams. No one should ever feel like they're guilty just because of their appearance or a vague description." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy fix and that it wouldn't happen overnight. But this was the first time in hours that he had felt like someone was genuinely trying to understand the depth of what had occurred. "I just want to make sure no one else has to go through what I've experienced today. No one else should have to sit in a holding cell because of a mistake. This kind of thing can't keep happening." Officer Thompson nodded. "We agree, and that's why we're going to make sure there are consequences for this. I'm going to personally ensure that this case is reviewed thoroughly and that steps are taken to prevent this from happening again. This will not be swept under the rug." Marcus felt the knot in his chest loosen a little. For the first time in hours, he felt like there was hope. Not just for his own case, but for the people who might face similar injustices in the future. This wasn't just about him. It was about changing the system so that it worked for everyone, not just a select few. As they spoke, the minutes ticked by, each one a reminder of how long Marcus had been waiting for answers. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Officer Thompson handed Marcus the paperwork for his release. "You're free to go, Mr. Williams. We've cleared up the misunderstanding, and you're not under arrest anymore." Marcus took the papers from her, his hands still trembling slightly. It was a strange feeling, walking out of the holding cell after everything that had happened. He wasn't sure whether to feel victorious or just relieved that it was finally over. He had always fought for justice, but now he was the one on the receiving end of a broken system. Still, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion, "for making this right." Officer Thompson gave a small, respectful nod. "We still have a lot to work on, but this is a step in the right direction." As Marcus walked out of the building, he was greeted by the cool evening air. It felt different now, sharper, clearer somehow. He looked up at the sky, the city lights casting long shadows across the street. It was a busy night, people going about their business, oblivious to the events that had just unfolded. For a moment, Marcus stood still, just taking it all in. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his wife, Janet. "Where are you?" "The kids are asking when you'll be home. We've missed you." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with warmth. He had been away from his family far too long. After everything that had happened, after the uncertainty, he was finally going to go home to them. He quickly typed a response. "I'm on my way. I'll explain everything when I get there. I love you." As he walked to his car, his mind was already shifting gears. He knew he had to speak out about what had happened. He had to use his voice to ensure that the injustices of the day weren't forgotten. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been unfairly targeted, wrongly accused, and unjustly treated. Marcus had fought for justice in the courtroom for years, but now he was fighting for something bigger, a change that would prevent this from happening to anyone else. Marcus didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. This experience wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He wasn't going to let it slide. He would make sure that people heard his story. He would make sure that the system was held accountable for its mistakes. This fight, the fight for justice, wasn't just his. It was for everyone who had ever felt wronged, overlooked, or dismissed. As he drove home, the city lights blurred in his rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't just about winning cases. It was about fighting for what was right, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. And Marcus was ready for that fight. When he pulled into his driveway and saw Janet and the kids waiting for him, his heart felt full. It wasn't just about going home. It was about rebuilding trust, repairing the damage that had been done, and making sure that his family and everyone else could feel safe in a world that too often failed to protect them. It had been a few days since Marcus had been released from the holding cell. The first few hours after his release had felt like a whirlwind. He had gone home to his family, hugged his wife, Janet, and his two kids, Sophie and Liam, tightly. He had explained what had happened, but it was still hard for them to grasp. After all, Marcus had always been the one to fight for justice, to stand up for what was right. Now he had experienced firsthand how the system could fail, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. But now, as he sat in his office, facing the reality of what had happened, he knew it was time to turn this painful chapter into something more. He had learned something valuable in the past few days. There was power in his voice, and that voice needed to be heard. It wasn't enough for him to just move on from this. He had to make sure that this didn't happen to anyone else. He had to take what happened to him and use it to fuel a larger conversation, a conversation about fairness, equality, and accountability. As Marcus thought about the next steps, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. The call rang once, then twice, before it was picked up. "Marcus!" The voice on the other end was familiar. It was his colleague, David, someone he had worked with on several cases over the years. "What's going on? You okay?" "David, we need to talk about everything that happened," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to keep this to himself. "I figured you'd want to talk about it," David said. "Come by my office and we'll go over it. I know you've been through a lot, but we need to figure out what comes next." Marcus agreed, and within the hour he was sitting in David's office, going over every detail of the arrest. They discussed how the officers had acted, how the system had failed him, and how it had failed so many others like him. As they spoke, Marcus realized something. The fight wasn't just about him getting justice for himself. It was about making sure that future generations didn't face the same unfair treatment. "I'm not going to let this go," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "This is bigger than me. It's about everything I've fought for over the years: equality, fairness, justice. I can't let this go without making sure something changes. This is my responsibility now." David nodded. understanding the weight of what Marcus was saying. You've always fought for justice, Marcus, but now this is your fight. You've got the platform, the voice, and the resources. You can do something with this. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly to share his story. He used his platform, his connections, and his voice to start conversations about the systemic issues in law enforcement. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and other lawyers who had experienced or witnessed similar injustices. It didn't take long before his story was picked up by local media, and soon national outlets were covering it. The public was listening. People were paying attention to what Marcus had to say. But the process wasn't easy. Marcus knew that change never came quickly. There were obstacles, resistance, and even pushback from people who didn't want to acknowledge the flaws within the system. But Marcus had seen this kind of resistance before. He knew how to navigate it, how to turn it into something that would drive him forward rather than hold him back. He wasn't in it for the headlines, though. He wasn't doing it for fame or recognition. This was personal. It was about making sure that no one else was wrongfully detained. No one else was treated with suspicion because of the color of their skin or a vague description. He wanted to make sure that future generations wouldn't have to deal with the same biases, the same unfair treatment that had been ingrained in the system for so long. As Marcus continued his advocacy, he met with other individuals who had faced similar circumstances, people who had been unfairly targeted, arrested, or detained for reasons that had nothing to do with their actions. Together, they formed a coalition, a group of people committed to fighting for change. Marcus knew that this wasn't something he could do alone. He needed the support of others, and he needed to make sure that their voices were heard as well. It wasn't just about changing the police force or the legal system. It was about changing the mindset of the public, making them see that systemic racism and bias were real issues that needed to be addressed. It wasn't enough to simply be not racist anymore. People needed to be actively anti-racist. They needed to stand up, speak out, and do their part to dismantle the systems that allowed inequality to persist. One afternoon, Marcus was invited to speak at a public forum about police reform and racial justice. It was a huge opportunity, and he knew it was his moment to make a lasting impact. As he stood at the podium, facing a room full of people, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He knew this wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about the stories of so many others who had been silenced for far too long. When I was detained, when I was handcuffed for no reason, it wasn't just me who was affected, Marcus began, his voice steady and strong. It was a reminder of how easy it is for people who look like me to be treated with suspicion, to be presumed guilty based on nothing more than a description. This isn't just my fight. This is a fight for everyone who's ever been wrongfully targeted, for everyone who's ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. The room was silent as Marcus spoke. He could feel the weight of the moment, and he knew that his words were having an impact. People were listening. They were starting to understand that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was part of a larger systemic issue that needed to be addressed. Marcus wasn't just advocating for his own freedom anymore. He was advocating for the freedom of everyone who had been oppressed, silenced, or unjustly treated. Over the following months, the coalition that Marcus had helped form gained momentum. They held rallies, organized protests, and met with lawmakers to push for meaningful change. It wasn't easy, but Marcus was no stranger to hard work. He had spent his career fighting for justice, and now he was fighting for something bigger, a future where everyone had an equal chance at fairness, a future where no one was judged by their appearance or background. Eventually, the police department where Marcus had been wrongfully detained conducted an internal review of the incident. The officers involved were held accountable, and changes were made to the procedures for handling stops and arrests. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Marcus knew that it was only the beginning, but it was progress, and that was something to build on. As the months turned into years, Marcus continued his work, using his platform and his voice to speak out against injustice and inequality. He never forgot the lessons he had learned from that day, how fragile freedom could be, and how important it was to stand up and speak out when something wasn't right. He knew the fight wasn't over. But with each step, with each victory, Marcus felt more confident that change was possible. He had seen it firsthand. Even the smallest actions could lead to big shifts in the world. And for Marcus, that meant everything. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for a future where everyone could feel safe, seen, and heard. And with that, Marcus Williams knew that the battle for justice would continue, not just for him, but for every single person who had ever been wronged by the system. It was a fight worth fighting.